Oh, wait. Pro streaming again. Shh. You didn't see nothing.
Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay. Reading time, everybody. Not news time, reading time. Let me pin that. Okay. Just gonna put this over here. Optimal reading comfort. And then I want to change the words at the bottom. Yeah, Manticore, it's amazing how common of a problem that is, isn't it? Here we go. Okay. So today, because of working with colonialism, unfortunately. Okay, well, oh, there, that's better. No. I thought presentation mode might work, but no, we're going like this. Okay. So we're going to start today. The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. Gearld Horne. Here's the contents. We've got preface, an introduction we'll do today. Then rebellious Africans, how Caribbean slavery came to the mainland. Free trade in Africans, did the Glorious Revolution unleash the slave trade? Revolt, Africans conspire with the French and Spanish. Building a white pro-slavery wall, the construction of Georgia. The Stono uprisings, will the Africans become the masters and the European slaves? Arson, murders, poisoning, shipboard insurrections, the fruit of the exhilarating slave trade. The biggest losers, Africans in the 7 Years' War. From Havana to Newport, slavery transformed. Settlers rebel against London. Abolition in London, Somerset's case and the North American aftermath, and the Counter Revolution of 1776. So today we'll start with the preface and the introduction. It was January 2012, and I was ecstatic, and with good reason. I had been working on the book at hand for some time, and I had traveled extensively. However, building renovations had prevented my access to the New York Historical Society in Manhattan until my tardy arrival in early 2012. However, as it turns out, my wait was rewarded amply when I encountered the richly informative Daniel Parrish Jr. slavery transcripts, which cover extensively colonial slavery in North America and beyond. Unfortunately, this treasure trove is not organized adroitly, which may account for its relative absence in the footnotes of scholars, and also sheds light on the nature of my references to it. Still, my research pre-generation has convinced me that this collection should be better known to scholars seeking to unravel the complexities of the 1776 revolt against British rule. For it is the argument of this book that slavery permeated colonial North America, underpinning the pre-1776 economy. In terms of not only agriculture, but insurance, banking, shipbuilding, and the like. Yet the enslaved resisted fiercely, as we will see, and did so quite often, at times with the aid of competing colonial powers, notably Spain and to an extent France. Their resistance helped to drive settlers from the Caribbean to the mainland, particularly in the years leading up to 1776. The sprawling landmass of the mainland versus the limited landmass of the Caribbean allowed European empires to more easily bump into one another, for example on the Georgia-Florida border, causing sparks to fly. The crucial turning point for North America and, arguably, the British Empire as a whole emerged in 1688 with the so-called Glorious Revolution, which, inter alia, caused the monarchy to retreat and led to the ascendancy of the rising class of merchants. This, in turn, empowered the private or separate merchants, entrepreneurs who wished to enter into the lushly lucrative market in enslaved Africans, to the detriment of the Royal African Company. These entrepreneurs descended manically upon Africa, igniting a quantum leap in the slave trade, which at once developed immensely the economy of the Americas, and, likewise, engendered ever more angry resistance from the enslaved, causing ever more anxious settlers to migrate to the mainland. The year 1688, with its simultaneous launching of vast economic transformation, particularly in North America, and a righteous instability driven by enslavement, is the hinge moment in the creation of what is now routinely referred to as today modernity. As the economy developed on the mainland, thoughts of independency grew, accordingly, along with slave resistance. The latter was manifested most dramatically in Manhattan in 1712 and 1741, and South Carolina in 1739. It is an error to view history of colonial British North America as simply pre-US history, in a teleological manner. It is likewise useful to integrate events in the Caribbean into our contemplation of the mainland. Though London's provinces in the Americas may not have been wholly unitary, it remains true that North Americans had been trained to regard southern mainland colonies as part of an extended Caribbean region that was primary source of wealth. Put simply, London realized that massive slave uprisings in Jamaica and Antigua could pretend the collapse of the Caribbean colonial project as a whole, as Africans strained to assert themselves forcefully, if not rule altogether. Such rebelliousness made London more susceptible to sweet reason and ultimately abolition, as it considered the further expenditure of blood and treasure that could have gone to bolster British India or territories elsewhere. At the same time, slave rebelliousness caused settlers, particularly on the mainland, to dig in their heels, hastening the split between province and metropolis. The slave resistance was aided immeasurably not only by the indigenous, but also, as noted, by competing colonial powers. As London jousted with Madrid in the Americas, both came to rely upon armed Africans, and this crucial factor, along with the substantial resources that had been expended in order to maintain a slave system, inexorably helped to spur a nascent abolitionist movement. Increasingly, the development of the economy on the mainland, including the ability to engage in mutually profitable trade arrangements with the French settlers in Hispaniola, along with the apprehension about the presumed anti-slavery tendencies of the British Crown, evidenced by the notorious edict of Lord Denmore of November 1775 in Virginia, helped to push the colonists into open revolt by 4th of July 1776. Though it may be hard to imagine at this late date, my conclusion in this book is that many Africans had different plans for the destiny of colonial North America that decidedly did not include a starring role by the now famed founding fathers and their predecessors, but instead contemplated a polity led by themselves in a league with the indigenous, and perhaps a compliant European power. As such, the ongoing persecution of descendants of mainland enslaved Africans is, in part, a continuing expression of what tends to befall those who were defeated in bloody warfare. Often, they are subjected to heinous collective punishment. In essence, simply because Euro-American colonists prevailed in their establishing of the US, it should not be assumed that this result was inevitable. History points to other possibilities, and contemplating them may shed light on at least why Africans suffered so grievously in the aftermath of the founding of the Republic. Strikingly, as London was moving towards abolition, the Republic was supplanting the British Isles as the kingpin of the global slave trade. Hence, this book diverges sharply from the consensus view of the origins of the post 1776 Republic, a view which has united a stunning diverse array of scholars. In short, unlike previous analysis, I do not view the creation of the Republic as a great leap forward for humanity, though I concede readily that it improved the lives of a countless number of Europeans. More than this, I believe that perhaps understandably, there has been a desire to create an uplifting anti-colonial narrative to explain the undergrid of the fruits of 1776. The problem is that, irrespective of the diverse ideological persuasions of the creators, this narrative serves to obscure the point that as 4th of July 1776 approached, Africans had been involved steadily in the poisoning and murdering and immolating of settlers, creating, at least, a yawning deficit of trust between Africans and Europeans. portraying the Africans as bit players supporting a revolt in 1776, dominated by Europeans, as the uplifting narrative tends to do, not only distorts and characterizes the historical record, but also obscures a trust deficit that may still be of relevance today. You might be thinking of this one right here. Are you? Hence, 1688 gave rise to a Cousins' War, but also a continuing civil war that was evidenced not only in 1776, when Africans largely sided with the crown, but also in 1836, when Texas split from Mexico, with the abolitionism of the latter being the signal factor. And then 1861 to 1865, when finally the Africans were able to escape bondage. In sum, 1688 delivered a promise of modernity to, or bourgeois society, or what has been called of late the end of history. Oh shit. Thank you very much. Thank you for the raid. Unelectable, welcome in, raiders. Get comfy, get cozy, because we are here. We're reading Counter Revolution of 1776. Welcome, Matt. I appreciate the raid. Hey, Jackbird. Alien HD. Great to see you, comrades. Welcome in. Welcome in. So what we're reading here is the Counter-Revolution of 1776. That is the Counter-Revolution of July 4th, 1776. So this is an extremely informative book by Gearld Horne, which essentially argues an important point, and we'll start this paragraph over. We're just in the preface now, so we haven't even gotten to the introduction. And this whole book is essentially arguing that the creation of America was not actually a net gain for humanity. Although Gearld Horne, again, does admit that it did improve the lives of countless number of Europeans. But it was not a great leap forward for humanity. So that's essentially what the book is about. Get comfortable. We're just starting. And then I got a bunch of news for today too. We're going to talk about the failed coup in Bolivia. I have, of course, some Al Jazeera. I have some Electric Intifada for you. We're still talking about the anniversary of the unleashing of the genocide against Koreans by the U.S. in 1950. So we have some more about that. We're going to look at the mass rallies held in Pyongyang. And we are going to look at this. A white paper was released by the Institute for American Studies of the DPRK Foreign Ministry. So this should be really interesting. So yeah, get comfortable. Oh yeah, and then I got a thing too for today on the same thing that's about who started the Korean War. I mean, I would say this book is a good book for people to start their journey of learning the truth about America, Manticore. Like, if you want to learn about the actual truth about America and its historical position regarding the development of humanity as a whole, this is the book. So it's very good. And that's why I am going to start this part right here over again, where he's talking about how 1688 marks the beginning, okay? Hence, 1688 gave rise to a Cousins' War, but also a continuing civil war that was evidenced not only in 1776, when Africans largely sided with the crown, which we'll talk, obviously get into much more detail with, but it was because of the crown, it was because of competing colonial powers, not because of some like want to actually get rid of the slave trade, but because it was threatening the hegemony of the British colonial power. And Native people and Black people were trying to take advantage of that in the struggle for their liberation. But also in 1836, when Texas split from Mexico, with the abolitionism of the latter being a signal factor. And then in 1861, 1865, when, finally, the Africans were able to escape bondage. In sum, 1688 delivered a promise of modernity, or bourgeois society, or what has been called of late the end of history, in the form of capitalism dripping in the blood of Africans who involuntarily provided the impetus for the takeoff. And the republicanism, which helped to unite Europeans in this enterprise, in the Americas, in the face of perpetual sedation and liquidation plots from the rambunctious labor force. However, this was an exceedingly elongated process that took decades to lurch towards a sort of justice in 1865. Or perhaps 1888, a precise 2 centuries after the tumult in London, with abolition in Brazil. To the extent that 1776 led to the resultant U.S., which came to captain the African slave trade, as London moved in an opposing direction towards a revolutionary abolition of this form of property. The much celebrated revolt of North American settlers can fairly be said to have eventuated as a counter-revolution of slavery. To the extent that the tumultuous events leading to 1776 track the exhilarated decline of the Royal African Company, of the sceptred Isle, and the rise of the newly empowered slave trade in the new republic. 1776 can fairly be said to have eventuated as a counter-revolution of slavery. Defenders of the so-called Confederate States of America were far from bonkers when they argued passionately that their revolt was consistent with the animating and driving spirit of 1776. Slavery fueled a rise in capitalism. However, ironically, breaking the bonds of slavery was necessary if capitalism was to realize its full potential. Not least since enslaved Africans were fiercely determined to destroy the wealth they were creating, along with the lords of the lash. Contradictorily, slavery was both a boost for the nascent capitalism and ultimately a fetter on its productive force. More than this, Chattel's slavery, grounded in racist chauvinism, of a uniquely Republican and toxic type, was one of the more profound human rights violations of the previous millennium. To the extent that 1776 gave such slavery a renewed lease on life, it was truly a lineal ancestor of 1861, and thus a counter-revolution of slavery. It is evident that this book sits on the shoulders of the work of previous scholars. Nevertheless, my own opinion is that it is more instructive to place this work in the context of a long line of writings by people of African descent, which have called into sharp question the events that constructed today's Americas, and the steep price paid by Africans as a result. Certainly, much has been written about the Revolutionary Era and the role of Africans and the indigenous, through beginning the story in the 1770s. As this book is intended to show, evades the pre-existing dynamics that crucially shaped this critical decade. An armed revolt, particularly in the incipient stages, creates a dynamic of its own, causing rebels to engage in actions. For example, positive overtures to Africans and indigenes, consistent with their previous to a degree subsequent behaviors. Moreover, I feel compelled to stress that when officials of colonial Cuba and Spanish Florida lent aid to Africans in the Carolinas, they were motivated more by self-interest than abolition. Otherwise, slavery in Havana would have ended well before the late 19th century. And this is the part that Midwestern Marks, in their book, if you've ever seen their book that they wrote, The Purity Fetish or whatever, they wrote some book on purity fetish anyway. And in the footnotes of that book, they try to portray Horne as like having sympathy for the British Empire or like loving the British Empire or something. But as he's pointing out here very, very clearly, he's saying, right here in the preface of the fucking book, we're only 12 pages in total, and he's already saying right here, moreover, I feel compelled to stress that when officials of colonial Cuba or Spanish Florida lent aid to Africans in the Carolinas, they were motivated more by self-interest than abolition. Otherwise, slavery in Havana would have ended well before the late 19th century. The same holds true for London's abolitionism, which too was self-interested and hardly inevitable. It emerged in part from a unique set of circumstances, shaped indelibly by the Crown's growing reliance on armed Africans, just as the rise of China in the 21st century was hardly inevitable, but shaped indelibly by the late 20th century circumstance of apprehension of the Soviet Union. Similarly, when Washington allied with Moscow in 1941 to 45, this alliance was driven by realpolitik, as opposed to a co-signing of the entire Soviet agenda, as we well know. So you see how inconsistent the logic of Midwestern Marx on that point is? And how consistent Gearld Horne is on this point? The enemy of my enemy is my friend continues to be the engine of international diplomacy, and was certainly operative in pre-1776 North America. And to echo a current phrase, during a good deal of the colonial era, as far back as Africans in the British colonies were concerned, Spain simply had the cleanest dirty shirt. Nevertheless, there was faint recognition on the mainland of reality recognized by a latter-day scholar, in contrast to Spanish and French slaves who were considered an inferior subject, wrote Thomas James Little in 1989. English slaves were considered to be a unique type of property, unquote. Quite able to tease out meaningful distinctions, rebellious Africans, when they were not engaged in hell-raising, tended to flee from Carolina to Florida, from New York to Quebec, and from Jamaica to Cuba. Not vice versa. All to London's detriment, creating a crisis for London that was hard to resolve without severe rupture. Then, when the rapturous rebels revolted in 1776, their previous concern about the supposed ubiquitous hand of Madrid stirring up Africans was transferred smoothly to hysterical concern about the supposed hand of London doing the same thing. This meant that their triumph forged a conflation of anti-monarchism and republicanism, and Africans standing in the way of the two, in a manner that virtually guaranteed that the path ahead would be exceedingly rocky for those who became U.S. Negroes, then African Americans. Nonetheless, as one of the few who has investigated systemically the dilemma of Africans enslaved and free from the 17th century to the present, across the continents and far-flung seas alike, I am tempted to conclude that the older radical slogan, black and white, unite and fight, is a prescription for a transformative change in this republic, needs to be supplanted, needs to be supplemented or supplanted altogether in favor of a less poetic and catchy Africans here and abroad unite and fight in league with a powerful foreign ally. Such a conclusion inferentially suggests a design flaw at the heart of the Republic. I apologize. Africans being excluded and persecuted not by accident but purposefully. That compels this sizable class of citizen to disregard Republican sovereignty in pursuit of justice. This aforementioned slogan is not the only aspect of this book that continues to resonate. The deregulation of the slave trade led to the mass entry into this dirty business of separate and private traders, which coincided with free trade in Africans and capital flight of this same valuable commodity. All of these italicized terms are part of today's jargon and should remind us of their less than glorious antecedents and their role as recurring building blocks of today's capitalist society. More than this, those who reside in a nation constructed by slavery need to think longer and harder about contemporary manifestations of this peculiar institution, not least in terms of the kind of capitalism and republicanism that now obtains in North America, but as well the degradation of labor in this nation, and how the racist stigmatizing of a formidable segment of the working class can reinforce a reactionary conservatism that bedevils the nation. My Manhattan ecstasy in January 2012 proved to be short-lived, as I sought futilely to hail a taxi from the sidewalk abutting the New York Historical Society on Central Park West, after gathering my glittering research nuggets on colonial slavery. Yet, I recall thinking at the time that these taxi drivers, some of whom had dark skin tones similar to my own, were rudimentarily reenacting the drama I had just researched moments earlier. That is, I was seemingly enduring what is now a reigning Manhattan cliche, being bypassed by taxis because of the color of my skin. The outward manifestation of African ascendancy. That is to say, as a putative descendant of mainland Africans who had to fight the formation of slaveholding republic, then a Jim Crow regime, I was continuing to incur a penalty as a result, this time in the form of having to walk part of the way to my next destination. As had happened previously in Gotham, when I was subjected to such a slight, I recalled my experience earlier in the century teaching at Hong Kong University, when this former colony had just reverted to Beijing's rule, where taxis would zip past Chinese to pick me up, on the presumed premise, perhaps, that I was not an indigene, but possibly a tourist, or a diplomat, capable of a nice tip, or, at least, a foreigner bearing no felonious intent. On the face of things, Chinese cabbies perceived me to be less of a threat than those of my ostensible homeland. Even then, I was wondering if China's rise would have a positive impact on the dire plight of my ebony compatriots in North America, just as Spain had centuries earlier. As I ambled along in the wintry clime of Manhattan, I smiled to myself, thinking that, dialectically, the added exercise I was receiving might allow me to live to fight another day, confirming the continuing viability of jiu-jitsu-like maneuvers which had allowed us Africans to survive for centuries in an ocean of hostility. A heartening thought to ponder roughly 240 years since abolitionism had begun to assert itself dramatically in London. That's our preface. Hey, Medicare. Welcome in. Okay, and now I will also read the introduction today as well. That way, tomorrow, or that way, Tuesday, rather, we will start right on chapter 1 of this, okay? So, here is the introduction, also by Gearld Horne. What does dialectically means? It means that all things are interconnected and always in motion. It was just past 10 in the morning on the 22nd of June, 1772, in a London courtroom, and the presiding magistrate, Lord Mansfield, had just made a ruling that suggested that slavery, the blight that had ensnared so many, would no longer obtain, at least not in England. A few nights later, a boisterous group of Africans, numbering in the hundreds, gathered for a festive celebration. Striking none defined as white were allowed, although they toasted Lord Mansfield, the first Scot to become a powerful lawyer, legislator, politician, and judge, with unbound enthusiasm. Others were not so elated, particularly in Virginia, where the former property in question, in this case, had been residing. Is it in the power of Parliament to make such a law? Can any human law abrogate the divine, the laws of nature, and the laws of God? Unquote, wrote one curiously questioning writer, indicating that this was not a sectional response. A correspondent in Manhattan near the same time assured that this ostensibly anti-slavery ruling will occasion a greater ferment in America, particularly in the islands, than the Stamp Act itself. A reference to another London edict that was then stirring controversy in the colonies. The radical South Carolinian William Drayton, whose colony barely contained an unruly African majority, was apologetic about this London decision, asserting that it would complete the ruin of many American provinces. This apocalyptic prediction was shaped inexorably by the inflammatory statements emanating from London courtroom. The lawyer for the enslaved man at issue sketched a devastating indictment of slavery, an institution that undergirded immense fortunes in the colonies. He observed that slavery was dangerous to the state, perhaps a veiled reference to the forced retreat of the colonists in Jamaica a few decades earlier, in the face of fierce resistance by African warriors designated as Maroons. Their militancy seemed to anger, at one point, the collapse of the colonial regime. Caribbean revolts were so frequent that, according to one analyst, this unrest underscored colonists' pathological fear of Africans as their natural enemy. A situation that was inherently unstable, unsustainable, but simultaneously indicated why this London case had fomented such raw emotion. This lawyer's reproach of slavery was not only part of enlightened conversation in London, for as far afield as Madrid and Paris, serious reconsideration of this institution had arisen. In the late 1750s, Hispaniola, dozens of Europeans, and thousands of livestock had succumbed to poisons administered by African herbalists. Unsurprisingly, French physiocrats had begun to raise searching questions about the future viability of slavery. Slavery inevitably bred angry dissatisfaction that could be quite destabilizing. particularly when combined with intervention by other European powers. Consequently, this attorney railed against the unlawfulness of introducing a new slavery into England from our American colonies or any other country. Yes, he conceded, quote, by an unhappy occurrence of circumstance, the slavery of Negroes is thought to have become necessity in America. But why should this pestilence be extended? Hanging ominously in the air was the implication that if slavery were to be deemed null and void in London, then why not in Charleston? Even before these foreboding words were uttered in London, the Virginia Gazette, whose audience had few qualms about the enslavement of Africans, had noticed that since this case had commenced, the spirit of liberty had diffused itself so far amongst the species of people, namely Negroes, that they have established a club near Charing Cross, where they meet every Monday night for more effectual recovery of their freedom. Unquote. The New Yorker was prescient, as we know, while the man from Carolina summarized neatly what was to befall the British holdings south of the Canadian border. The eminent 20th century historian Benjamin Quarles argued that this London case hastened slavery's downfall in New England. Moreover, what came to be known as Somerset's case emerged in the wake of a number of decisions emanating from London that unnerved the powerful slaveholders of North America, and was followed by others, all of which aided in lighting a fuse of revolt that detonated on the 4th of July, 1776. This is a book about the role of slavery and the slave trade in the events leading up to the 4th of July, 1776, in igniting the rebellion that led to the founding of the United States of America. Notably, as the seditiousness of rebellious Africans intersected with the machinations of European powers, Spain and France most particularly. It is a story that does not see the founding of USA as inevitable or even a positive development, for Africans or indigenes most particularly. I argue that a number of contingent trends led to 1776. As we know, the now leading metropolis that is New York was once controlled by the Dutch. The area around Philadelphia was once colonized by the Swedes. New Orleans had French, then Spanish, then French rule once more. Jamaica went from Spain to Britain in the mid-17th century. The colonizing of the Americas was a chaotic process, for which theology was particularly inappropriate. It was not foreordained that the stars and stripes would flutter at all, least of all over much of North America. The colonizing of the Americas was a wild and woolly process. Guy Fawkes and Oliver Cromwell were surging to prominence, and London's creation of colonies in the Americas was exhilarating. These two men represented plotting and attempting to overturn an already unstable status quo that was hard to hide from Africans. Moreover, the colonial projects unfolded alongside a kind of Cold War between Catholics and Protestants, studded with the periodic equivalent of a kind of Sino-Soviet split that from time to time disunited Madrid and Paris. The chaos of colonialism, combined with this defining religious rift, ironically created leverage for Africans, as they could tip the balance against one European power by aligning with another, or with the indigenous. Then there was the developing notion of whiteness, smoothing tensions between and among people hailing from the old continent, which was propelled by the need for European unity to confront raging Africans and indigenes. This, inter alia, served to unite settlers in North America with what otherwise might have been their French and Spanish antagonists, laying the basis for a kind of democratic advance. as represented in the freedom of religion in the emergent U.S. Constitution. Surely, the uniting of Europeans from varying ethnicities under the umbrella of whiteness broadened immeasurably the anti-London project, with a handsome payoff delivered to many of the anti-colonial participants in the form of land that was once controlled by the indigenous, often stocked with enslaved Africans. Not to mention a modicum of civil rights denied to those who were not defined as white. Ironically, the founders of the Republic have been hailed and lionized by left, right, and center for, in effect, creating the first apartheid state. Thank you, Workers' Pulse. Salute. Assuredly, as with any epochal event, the ouster of London from a number of its North American colonies was driven by many forces. Not just slavery and the slavery trade, a point I well recognize. As ever, there were numerous economic reasons for a unilateral declaration of independence. When British forces in 1741 were in the midst of attacking Cuba and Cartagena, an officer of the crown mused, in case of victory, about settling North American colonists in the east end of Cuba, since if they could be settled there, it would be much better than their returning home to a country overpeopled already, which runs them on setting up manufactures to the prejudice of their mother country. Unquote. 9 years earlier, another Londoner fretted that while once almost all the sugar made in the West Indies was brought to England in British-built ships, now it is as notorious that one ship in three which bring the commodity are New England built and navigated by New England sailors. From whence it follows that New England has supplanted Britain in its navigation to those colonies, one part in three. Unquote. These North American colonies were surpassing Britain in making hats, so useful in frequently inclemented weather. Thus, it was concluded portentously that independency of these colonies must be the consequence, a fatal consequence to this kingdom. This independency was highly probable by 1761. Yet, another Briton was arguing that these North American colonies were far from being beneficial to Great Britain, that it would have been much better if no such continent or no such colonies had ever existed, since from the very establishment they have been growing evil to Great Britain, which has thereby laid the foundation of an empire that may thereafter make her a colony. The emphasis is added by Horne here. These economic conflicts were all very real and deeply felt by settlers and Londoners alike. Yet, even when one posits this economic conflict as overriding all others and sparking revolt, the larger point was that it was slavery, and that was the driving these fortunes, particularly in the North American colonies. For example, in Rhode Island, epicenter of the slave trade during a good deal of the 18th century, these merchants of odiousness moved rapidly to plow their vast fortunes into sectors that competed aggressively with the mother country, notably manufacturing, insurance, and banking, indicating that slavery remained at the root of the conflict. Negroes were considered essential to New England's prosperity, argues historian Lorenzo Green, speaking of the colonial era. In South Carolina, always on edge because of the presence of resistive African majority, often in league with Spanish Florida, care was taken to build roads and establish ferries in order to more effectively gain access to land rocked by slave revolts. But this infrastructure spending also spurred economic development generally. In sum, the argument between the colonies and London was, in a sense, a chapter in a larger story whose first lines were written in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution, when the crown was forced to take a step back as a rising merchant class stepped forward, not least in corroding the monarch's hegemony in the slave trade. Arguably, it was then that the groundwork was laid for the takeoff of capitalism, a trend in which slavery and the slave trade played an indispensable role. The growing influence of merchants in the aftermath of 1688 turbocharged the slave trade, which allowed for spectacular profits growing from investments in the Americas and the forging of a wealthy class there which chafed under London's rule. It was 1696, and that the House of Commons received a petition objecting to the monopoly on this hateful trade in humans then held by the Royal African Company. The petition was signed by individuals referring to themselves as merchants and traders of Virginia and Maryland, who argued that their plantations were capable of much greater profit and production, and if they were sufficiently supplied with Negroes, they would produce twice the quantity they do now. Unquote. Indeed, the shortage of slaves was hindering the development of the tobacco colonies. After wrangling, their prayers were answered, leading to spectacular increases in the number of Africans in chains crossing the Atlantic. This business benefited handsomely some entrepreneurs in New England, notably in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where the trade flourished. This region contained the greatest slave trading communities in America, according to Lorenzo J. Green. The profits from the slave trade were almost incredible. Seldom has there been a more lucrative commerce than the traffic in Negroes, unquote, since gross profits were sometimes as high as 16%, as the slave trade easily became the most lucrative commerce of the 17th and 18th century. The Puritan colonies, says Green, were the greatest slave trading communities in America. From Boston, Salem, and Charlestown in Massachusetts, from Newport, Providence, and Bristol in Rhode Island, and from New London and Hartford, emerged these vessels of opprobrium and profit, and of the American ships involved in shipboard insurrections, those from New England suffered the most, with Massachusetts leading the pack. Simultaneously, this phenomenon bonded colonies north and south on the altar of slavery and nervousness about African intentions. To be sure, for the longest period, it was the sugar colonies of the Caribbean that were the cash cow for London. In 1700, the average English person consumed 5 pounds of sugar per year. In 1850, the figure was 35 pounds. By value, sugar had become Britain's number 2 import after cotton. Poor people in England spent about 5% of their wages on sugar. Sugar planters, as a result, became fabulously wealthy and influential in London itself, as William Beckford, whose fortune was centered in Jamaica, became Lord Mayor of this sprawling metropolis, only to be mocked as Negro whipping Beckford. I bet Americans eat close, Sam. I bet they do. Yet, or more. Yet, because the gain was so potentially stupefying, this dirty business bred conflict among the European powers, almost effortlessly, igniting piracy and privateering. All of which, as we shall see, allowed Africans to tip the balance against one of these powers, which most cases meant disfavoring London and its colonies. In a like fashion, The gargantuan wealth generated by trade in human commodities fed conflict between London and the colonies over taxes and who should pay importers or exporters, not to mention classes between insurers and merchants over the loss at sea or the much dreaded shipboard insurrection. At a certain point, some colonists may have wondered if deluging the mainland with Africans was part of a ploy by the metropolis to place in their backyard a force that could discipline, if not eliminate them. Africans were victimized by this trade, but the class of interest opened the door for their engaging in political arbitrage. This influx of Africans also bailed out the colonial enterprise in another sense. For, as the historian Colin G. Galloway has observed, up until the end of the 17th century, the British had feared for the survival of the infant American colonies. By 1698, the RAC was obliged to yield and rescued the colonial enterprise when so-called separate traders and private traders filled the breach with slave trade profits, and filled their profits with filthy lucre, many of them enabled to climb the class ladder to esteemed merchant status. Thus, in the 15 years prior to 1698, slavers transported close to 5,500 enslaved Africans to the North American mainland. And in the 15 years after, the figure increased dramatically to more than 15,000. The heralded reforms flowing in the aftermath of 1688 were as important to the slave trade escalations as the reforms of 1832 were to slave emancipation. Finally, in 1750, London declared the trade to Africa to be even more free and open, which sent a cascade of Africans across the Atlantic to the mainland, with wide consequences hardly envisioned at the time. This enormous influx of Africans laid the foundation for concomitant growth of capitalism. The advent of this system has been seen widely as schematically as a leap forward from the strictures of feudalism, and therefore a great leap forward for humanity as a whole. Nonetheless, this trade did not signal progress for the Africans, as their continent was besieged by separate traders, with the demanded energy of crazed bees. It was an early example of the immense profit and productivity and devastation that accompanied free trade, but this time in Africans. In fact, to the extent that 1776, I mean, it was probably the case back in those days too, but yeah. In fact, to the extent that 1776 led to the ossification of slavery and an increase in the illegal slave trade captured by U.S. nationals, particularly after 1808, when it was thought to have gone into desuetude. 1776 marks a counter-revolution. The de facto repudiation of Somerset's case on the mainland was an affirmation of the necessity of slavery, and this, at least for the Africans, meant a counter-revolution. The affirmation in turn made the explosion in 1861 a deepening of the counter-revolution of slavery, and the continuously heightened denunciation of the import of Somerset's case, virtually inevitable. Such was the onrushing momentum, the electrifying intensity of this powerful counter-revolution that, arguably, it continues today, albeit in a different form. Inexorably, the process of brutal and hurried enslavement generated an opposing and fierce resistance. Reports of various plots and conspiracies by the enslaved were rising sharply in the years preceding 1776. What was at play was a crisis of rapid change. when the pace, force, and pressure of events increased sharply in a frenzied manner, making pervasive ruptures invariably unavoidable. The enormous influx of Africans and the settlers' intoxication with the wealth they produce meant that more whites had to be attracted to the continent to countervail the ferocity and fettered labor force, and ultimately an expanded set of rights for these European migrants, along with land seized from the indigenous, was critical in enticing them. The unforgiving racial ratios in the Caribbean basically determined that slave rebellions would be more concentrated and riotous there. Yet this placed London in a vice, for, as noted, there were growing reservations about focusing investment in North America, giving that region's growing competitiveness, while militant Africans were driving settlers away from the Caribbean, precisely to North America. Yet this brought London no increase. This brought London no surcrease, since the arrivals of these enterprising individuals in North America brought as well those who had experience in the fright of righteous Africans. It was in early 1736 that a conspiracy was exposed in Antigua for the enslaved to liquidate the European settlers, according to the authorities. Quote, all the white inhabitants of this island were to be murdered, and a new form of government to be established by the slaves among themselves, unquote, as they were determined to possess the island entirely. This was preceded by yet another horrid plot, quote unquote, that was exposed in early 1729, in which the enslaved were determined to cut off every white inhabitant of Antigua. Eliza Lucas, the daughter of the lieutenant governor of Antigua, promptly migrated to South Carolina, where she became the spouse of Charles Pinckney, a leader of this colony, and their sons became leaders of the revolt against London. Unsurprisingly, she found Carolina greatly preferable to the West Indies, though by March 1741 she was anxiety-ridden once more, as Charleston, she thought, was to be, quote, destroyed by fire and sword, to be executed by the Negroes before the first day of next month, unquote. Then, as some of these colonists fled northward, they brought with them enslaved Africans, well aware that their oppressors were vulnerable, which was not the kind of insight conducive to stability in the mainland colonies. Among these was the influential Isaac Royal, who, by 1737, it was said, had arrived in Massachusetts with a parcel of Negroes designed for his own use, and a willingness to pay the duty of impost. In a province where, as elsewhere, nervousness was about the growing presence of enslaved Africans was growing. Then there was Josiah Martin, the first colonial governor of North Carolina, who outraged fellow settlers in the immediate prelude to 1776 by allegedly threatening to free and unleash Africans against rebels. He too had roots in Antigua, and thus had reason to possess a healthy regard for the fighting spirit of Africans and their own desire for domination, a point that may have occurred to residents of what became the Tahitial state. As settlers fled from the Caribbean to the mainland of North America, they brought with them nerve-jangling experiences with Africans that hardened their support of slavery, just as abolitionism was arising in London. But the point was that rebellious Africans were causing Europeans to flee the Caribbean for the mainland, as the productive forces in the latter were already burgeoning. The following pages will reveal that slave resistance in the Caribbean too merits consideration when contemplating the origins of the U.S. Thus, in 1750, 50,000 more Africans lived in the islands than on the other mainland. But as 1776 approached, 30,000 more Africans lived on the mainland than on the islands. Likewise, in 1680, almost 9 out of 10 Africans under London's jurisdiction in the Americas lived in the Caribbean, and half resided on the small island of Barbados, while the Negro population on the mainland was relatively small. This rapid transition to the mainland by 1750 reflected many forces, particularly investors betting on the mainland more than the islands, as Africans had inflamed these small territories. But this transition occurred as restiveness was growing on the mainland about the nature of colonial rule. The mainland and the metropolis were approaching confrontation for another reason. Abolitionism was rising in London, not least because Britain was becoming increasingly dependent on African soldiers and sailors. It was not easy to enslave those of this important category of workers, particularly when they carried weapons. One observer detected 12 black Moor sailors serving in one of the king's ships at Bristol in 1645. Nor was it unknown that black body servants to rise into battle alongside the Wronghead or Cavalier masters. Some of these men, whose presence was recorded on Civil War battlefields, may well have been born in these islands. The Civil War in which these Africans participated, and the fractiousness of English, then British, politics virtually preordained that various island factions would seek the support of Africans, notably as their numbers escalated in the 18th century. Moreover, a number of Irishmen, quite dissatisfied with London, often sought succor with the crown's most obstinate foes, providing further impetus for reliance on Africans. Striking in early 1748, in South Carolina, a plot of enslaved was uncovered to liquidate European settlement, which was said to be assisted by an Irishman, Lawrence Kelly. In the run-up to 1776, there were numerous Irish soldiers of fortune who had thrown in their lot with His Catholic Majesty in Spain, including Alejandro O'Reilly, Spain's chief representative in New Orleans, and General Richard Wall, who served in the post of Spanish Secretary of State. The powerful O'Reilly was deemed to be the most respected figure in the military of Spain. Many Scots were similarly unhappy, a discontent that has yet to disappear. The Act of Union formally consolidating Scotland's rule in the United Kingdom came only in 1707. There were two massive uprisings, 1715 and 1745, that had a particular resonance in the Highlands, where resistance was the strongest, which happened to be a point of departure for numerous migrants to North America. Some of these migrations were involuntary, as prisoners of war were shipped en masse to the colonies, many of whom arrived in no mood to compromise with London and eager for revenge. Satisfying the needs of these migrants often meant massive land grants to them in the colonies, necessitating either enslaved Africans to work the land or armed Africans offshore to protect them from attack. Goals at cross purposes leading to strains in the colonial project. Thus, in early 1776, Arthur Lee of Virginia was gleeful as he reported from London. The Irish troops go with infinite resistance to North America, he averred. The strong guards are obliged to be kept upon the transports to keep them from deserting wholesale. The Germans, too, I am well informed, are almost mutinous. London, he said, found it impossible to recruit in London, Ireland, or Scotland, though the leading people of the last are a man almost violently against America. The presumed unreliability of the Irish and Scots facilitated London's increased reliance on African soldiers and sailors. Yet, the sight of armed Africans was quite unsettling to the settlers. It was in 1768 that Bostonians were treated to the sight of Afro-Caribbean drummers of the 29th Regiment actually punishing their fellow white soldiers. In the heart of Boston Commons, these Negroes whipped about 10 alleged miscreants for various misdeeds. One can only imagine how such a sight would have been received in Carolina, though such displays gave resonance to a growing perception that London would move to free the enslaved, arm them, and then squash colonies already perceived as a growing rival. It was also in Boston in 1768 that John Hancock and other eminent petitioners accused the Redcoats of encouraging slaves to cut their masters' throats and to beat, insult, and otherwise ill-treat said masters, quote unquote. It was felt that with the arrival of more Redcoats, the Africans surmised they would soon be free, the Liberty Boys' slaves. It was not only the British who felt compelled to place weapons in the arms of Africans. It was in 1766 that Louisiana's governor, Etienne Boucher Pierre de Salver, asserted that since soldiers fled at the first flash of the Indian gun, it would be much better to trust Negroes on the battlefield and use them as soldiers, because they, at least, were brave men. Actually, the governor was an inadequate sociologist, for what drove the indomitable courage of the Africans was the perception that, if captured, they could easily wind up in slavery, while their European counterparts, alternatively, had numerous options available, including becoming property owners, stocked precisely with the enslaved. London felt compelled to rely upon Negro soldiers and sailors as the colonists came to rely upon Negro slaves. This was becoming an unbridgeable chasm. The Crown, the sovereign in both London and the colonies, had created a highly combustible political volcano. This instability was also propelled by another contradiction that the Crown helped to create. The model in the mother country was based upon a certain privilege for the English as against the Irish and Scots. In contrast, the colonies, desperate for men and women defined as white, to counter the fearsome presence of Africans in the prelude to 1776, could empower the Irish and Scots and provide them with more opportunity. All this was occurring as economic conflicts brewed in the transatlantic relationship. Ultimately, the mainland model based on racial privilege overwhelmed the London model based on ethnic privilege. London's ethnic approach implicitly, at times explicitly, sacrificed the interests of Irish and Scots and Welsh, and even the English of certain class backgrounds, made up for the shortfall by seeking to attract Africans to the banner, a policy propelled not least by competition with Madrid. But such a policy could only alienate mainland settlers, driving them toward a unilateral declaration of independence on the 4th of July, 1776. One espies part of this trend unfolding in the Chesapeake during this tumultuous era. Beginning in the 1680s and stretching until at least the 1720s, there was a decided shift from the use of servants to the use of slaves. As the population of the latter increased at least twice the rate of the European-derived population, instability increased. But for present purposes, note that the whole term white, the vector of a potentially rising identity politics, still operates centuries later, only began to supplant Christian and free as favored designations in 1690, as the monopoly of the Royal African Company eroded and separate, private traders began descending in droves on Africa, providing the human capital for economic expansion. In short, the privilege of whiteness was based heavily upon the increased presence of Africans, But since mainlanders were coming to suspect that London would deploy the Negroes against them, or at least had a more expansive view of their deployment than settlers, this meant that independence in 1776 was tied up with complicated, even fearful sentiments about humans designated as slaves. This expansion in the colonies, fueled by enslavement of Africans, then undergirded the conflict with London that erupted in 1776. Unfortunately for London and its energetic North American colonies, there were other forces that had a vote on the future. In retrospect, it seems appropriate that the Spanish term for blacks, that is, Negroes, invaded the English language almost as effortlessly as the bronze troops of His Catholic Majesty invaded the territory ostensibly controlled by London. For as early as 1555, Madrid was deploying in the Americas attacking forces heavily composed of Africans. And by 1574, in Havana, the darkest of us all had their own militias under African command. Thus, as Africans began flooding into North America, forced to endure the most heinous of circumstances, this prepared a delicate recipe for the exquisite taste of Spain, which wished to reverse London's gains. It was mid-1742, as London and Spain were at war once more, that Madrid's man in Havana barked out blunt orders. Quote, after taking possession of Port Royal, South Carolina, it will be proper to send out Negroes of all languages, some of which should accompany the militia of this place for this very purpose. To convoke the slaves of the English in the plantations round about, and offer, in the name of our king, liberty, if they will deliver themselves up of their own accord, and to say that the lands will be assigned to them in the territories of Florida, which they may cultivate and use themselves as owners, under the direction and laws of the Kingdom of Spain. In the long run, enslaved Africans in the British colonies, and then the early U.S. itself, may have absorbed Iberian notions about the relation between slavery and freedom. Notably, the seditious notion that freedom was permissible goal for a slave. The threat from Spanish Florida led directly to the creation of London's colony in Georgia. A motive force for the founding in 1733 was to forge a white buffer where African slavery was to be barred between South Carolina, which labored anxiously with a Negro majority, and Spanish Florida, from whence armed Africans continually probed. Establishing Georgia evidently did not hamper unduly Madrid's plans, particularly when a few years after the founding, South Carolina endured the Stono Revolt, the bloodiest in the history of colonial North America, in which, it appears, Spain played a starring role. Thus, it was also in mid-1742 that the founding father of Georgia, James Oglethorpe, confessed disconsolately that the devilish Spaniards had fomented a mutinous temper at Savannah, and, as a result, the destruction of that place was but part of their scheme for raising a general disturbance through all North America. Their correspondence with the Negroes, too, fatally manifested in the fire at New York and Charleston, and the insurrection of the Negroes in Carolina. These were not Oglethorpe's views alone. The idea was growing that the South Carolina, then Georgia border, separating British from Spanish soil, was the soft underbelly, the Achilles heel of London's mainland colonial project that could push the Union Jack back to the Canadian border. It was in mid-1741 that an official investigation, poking through the debris of September 1739, Stono uprising by the enslaved, which led to buckets of blood being shed by Carolina colonists. More than 24 were slaughtered. Observe that these Africans would not have made this insurrection had they not depended on Florida as a place of reception afterwards. This was very certain, and that the Spaniards had a hand in prompting them to this particular action, there was but little room for doubt. For the previous July, a Spanish official in Florida arrived in Charlestown with about 30 aides, one of which was a Negro that spoke English very well. This arrival was under the pretense of delivering a letter. The Oglethorpe, though it must have been known that he did not reside there. It was feared that this Negro was tasked to incite Carolina Africans. Oglethorpe thought he knew why Madrid relied so heavily on armed Africans, and inexorably gave the intensity of religiosity. The reason was to be found in Catholicism. Madrid and Paris, he stressed, contained 100,000 cloister females, not permitted to propagate their species, and the number of males in a state of celibacy is still abundantly greater. Besides, a considerable part of their great armies tended to resolve against marriage, meaning a birth dearth that could only be resolved by a more dedicated inclusion of Africans that Protestant London abjured. If Oglethorpe had paid closer attention to Iberian politics, he might have noticed that, like Scotland, Catalonia, which included Barcelona, was not wholly reconciled to being administered by Madrid. It was on the 11th of September 2012 that an estimated 1.5 million Catalonians called for more autonomy for this region, which contained a population of about 7.5 million. It was on that date in 1714, at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, that the Bourbon monarchy suppressed regional institutions. Madrid's reliance upon Africans and the Americans may have seemed less risky than reliance upon men with roots in Catalonia. Ultimately, the clash between London and Madrid at the South Carolina, Georgia-Florida border in the 1740s proved decisive for the future of what was to become the U.S. on the same level as the better-known conclusion of the 7 Years' War of 1763. Yet this former struggle, even more than what befell Quebec, had the enslavement of Africans at its throbbing heart. Moreover, after the 1740s, Georgia's rule as a white equivalent of the Berlin Wall rapidly crumbled, bringing more Africans to the mainland and thus increasing the anxieties of the mainland settlers. There was a kind of arms race that ensnared London and Madrid, involving competition for the often angry affections of Negroes. London, with a more developing empire and a relatively small population, could hardly ignore Africans. London's negotiations in the 1730s with Jamaican Maroons suggested that the Crown recognized early on the value of an entente with Africa. Revolution! Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Appreciate your support, comrade. That means a ton. Thank you, thank you, thank you. In this contrast, London was at a blunt disadvantage.
Let's go, Smokes. Let's go, Smokes.
I'll put that in the hopper. Not least since its blustering mainland colonies had opted for a development model based on the mass enslavement of Africans and the reluctance to build an escape hatch for free Africans. The very name, St. Augustine, Florida, sent a frisson of apprehension coursing down the spines of the British, particularly after it became a citadel where armed Africans were known to reside. By the late 1720s, British subjects returning to Carolina, battered and bruised from captivity in Florida, told spine-shaking tales of Africans and the indigenous selling British scalps for 30 Spanish pieces of 8. Anyway, unfortunately for the settlers, it was not only Carolina that was terrified by the dual prospects of internal revolt and external invasion, particularly from Spanish Florida. For this dual nightmare was a frequent topic of discussion in Virginia at the highest level. Moreover, London was administering an overstretching empire, which too necessitated the employment of more Africans. By 1757, after a battle with Bengal's Muslim viceroy, the East India Company found itself in possession of a territory 3 times larger than England. Less than a decade later, the company had successfully undermined the ruler of Adwa, the largest of the Mughals' empire's provinces. Yet, the distraction of India benefited the North American rebels, but it also underscored the importance of Africans as a military force in the Americas. London probably undermined its cause with the mainland colonists during the all-important siege of Havana in 1762. There was conscription in North America for this campaign, which admittedly was designed in no small part to ease Spanish pressure on the Carolinas and Georgia, though these settlers thought their time could have been better spent subduing the indigenous and the land they controlled. But then London's commanders were instructed that the corpse of Negroes to be raised in Jamaica for this battle should have an equal share in all booty gained from the enemy in common with his regular troops. Unquote. This only served to add heft to the gnawing feeling that on the mainland that settlers were being treated like Africans, which, in their argot, meant being treated like slaves. Britain fondly ousted the Spanish from rule in St. Augustine in 1763, though the future Sunshine State continued to be the dog that didn't bark, since it was the 14th colony that did not revolt in 1776, perhaps because Africans continued to play a martial role there, and like most Africans, were not enthusiastic about settlers' revolt that argued an obfuscation of slavery. Strikingly, Africans also fled en masse as London took the reins of power. Interestingly, in 1776, Governor Patrick Tonin, in what was then British East Florida, created 4 black militia companies to join in defense of the province, mostly with success, designed to foil attacks from Georgia, with which these companies then proceeded to attack. In summary, the post-1688 tumult brought London mixed blessings. Surely, the enhanced slave trade it augured lined the pockets of numerous merchants in Bristol and Liverpool, but in Rhode Island too, which instigated dreams of independence. This tumult delivered more Africans to the hemisphere who were not immune to the seductive appeal of Madrid. This tumult also brought more Negro insurrectionists who helped to spur an abolitionist movement that served to create a gulf between London and its increasingly obstreperous colonies. Damn you, Horne. These Africans played a pivotal role in spurring once proud British subjects to revolt against the crown. Thanks to the final colonial governor in Virginia, Lord Dunmore. He was viewed as a villain by the rebels, particularly after his notorious November 1775 decree to free and arm enslaved Africans in order to squash the anti-colonial revolt. Dispatched to bolster his deteriorating rule were 160 men from the 14th Regiment of St. Augustine. Right. Thank you, Dorian. But often forgotten when Dunmore is invoked is the run up to November 1775, when rebellious Africans had sought to eliminate settlements, leading some colonists to feel that that the world could be upended and they could assume a status below that of vassals. Thus, the threat of Negro revolt was magnified in the desperation driven by the Yamasee War, featuring the indigenous rampaging against settlers, which led to the arming of Africans in South Carolina in 1715. In other words, in addition to competing European powers, for example Spain, allying with Africans, settlers also had to worry about slaves bolstering revolts of the indigenous. Engaged typically in dickering and aberrage, simultaneously Africans were also negotiating with and cooperating with raiding parties by the indigenous. In some instances, they even entered into formal alliances with the indigenous and commenced their own unilateral wars against the colony. There must be great caution, several planters warned, lest our slaves, when armed, might become our masters. This was profoundly significant fear that hovered like a dark cloud over the colonial project, a fear London unwittingly ignited into raging fever as 1776 approached with its tentative steps towards abolition, while arming and deploying African soldiers in the colonies. Besieged by Africans, the indigenous, and European powers alike, mainland settlers found their options narrowing. Creating a buffer class of free Africans was a potential alternative to what appeared to be an impending disaster. Indelicately, Governor William Gooch of Virginia had to explain in 1736 why such policies were inappropriate for his province. Why pass a law, he was asked, depriving free Negroes and mulattoes of the privilege of voting at any election of burgesses or at any other elections? Well, he huffed, recently there was a conspiracy discovered among the Negroes to cut off the English, wherein the free Negroes and mulattoes were much suspected to have been concerned, which will forever be the case. Indeed, he continued, such was the insolence of the free Negro at that time, that the next assembly thought it necessary to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes by excluding them from the great privilege of a free man, well knowing they always did and ever will adhere to and favor the slaves. Unquote. Mainland settlers rallied against the Elder Gooch. You're distracting me with your Gooch talk. Mainland settlers. See, now I can't even. Mainland settlers railed against overtures to Africans, while they made overtures to London's staunchest foes. In early 1751, London was informed that mainland settlers were involved in a clandestine trade with the French, Dutch, and Danes that was such a success that now these devious merchants were seeking to introduce foreign sugar into Great Britain itself, along with great quantities of foreign rum into Ireland as well as into Halifax. In turn, mainlanders were bringing to North America all kinds of French and Dutch merchandise, directly interfering with those of Great Britain. This was causing irreparable injury to the commerce and manufactures of the mother country, and to the great increase and strength and riches of Britain's most dangerous rivals, leading inexorably to impending ruin falling upon Great Britain. In 1756, London railed against an illegal trade that had been carried out between British plantations and the French settlements. Indeed, Mainland trade with Hispaniola was so sizable, particularly with regard to the trade implicating slavery and the slave trade, that it may have contributed to the demographic racial imbalance leading directly to the vaunted Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, meaning these mainland settlers were active agents in two of the major developments of the past few centuries. In 1762, British officer Geoffrey Amherst complained that some of the merchants on this continent, particularly those of Pennsylvania and New York, were entering into schemes for supplying Havana with provisions. In August 1776, the British seafarer James Stokes had just arrived on the French controlled Hispaniola, noticed armed North American vessels loading arms and ammunition, presumably for the anti colonial revolt. Thus, even before 1756 or 1763, these settlers, apparently unable to resist the stupendous profits emerging from an ascending slave driven capitalism, were busily cutting various deals while their erstwhile opponents, particularly the French, even though London repeatedly warned that this was jeopardizing British interests. The settlers had good reason to believe that if they cut a deal with Madrid and Paris against British interests, they would emerge as the eventual winners. In other words, from 1756 to 1763, London fought an expensive and largely successful war against Paris and Madrid to oust the latter two from a good deal of North America, to the benefit of the colonists, then sought to raise taxes to pay for this gigantic venture, only to have the settlers go behind the back of London and conspire with Spain and France against the British. Yet, even this gloss on the founding should not be allowed to downplay the role of Africans, for it was their conspiring with the Spaniards in Florida, in particular, which was the driving force behind the 7 Years' War that contributed to London's loss. London had created an inherently unstable colonial project based on mass enslavement of Africans, who could then be appealed to by Spanish neighbors and wreak havoc, and an inability to hedge against the fiasco that such a policy promised by building a buffer class of free Negroes and mulattoes. This conspicuous weakness drew London into a seemingly endless cycle of conflicts with Spain and its frequent ally France, culminating in the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. This proved to be a catastrophic victory for London, as in eroding these external threats to the colonies, it allowed the settlers to concentrate more of their ire on London itself, leading to the 1776 unilateral Declaration of Independence. That is to say, before 1763, mainland settlers were huddling in fear of Negro insurrection, combined with foreign invasion, particularly from Spanish Florida or possibly French Canada. Afterward, it appeared to a number of colonists, particularly as abolitionist sentiment grew in London, that Negro insurrection would be coupled with a throttling of the colonies by redcoats, many of them bearing an ebony hue. Minimally, the mainland settler deal with Madrid, in particular, could forestall the eventuality of another Stono. No small matter as reports of slave conspiracies rose in the years immediately preceding 1776. The threats to London's interests were multiplying, as some mainland settlers were busily conspiring with the Crown's enemies. London did not seem to realize that when the RAC monopoly eroded, set in motion were virtually unstoppable economic forces that would place stressing strain on mainland provinces, ultimately setting them adrift towards independence. The traditional narrative of the Republic's founding has emphasized insufficiently the immorality and transporter ethos that came to define capitalism, which often was at odds with the traditional notions of patriotism and even sovereignty. This trend was reflected in the earliest stages of the mainland revolt. Quite naturally, this dearth of patriotism also came to characterize Africans. Human capital which propelled this system, who had little interest in identifying their interest with that of their so-called masters. Moreover, the settlers thought that London's special relationship with Africans had gone too far, to the point where they thought they had reason to fear that the crown's sable arm would come down with a crash upon their heads. Quote, every slave might be reckoned a domestic enemy, according to Benjamin Franklin, speaking almost 2 decades before 1776. Just before the 4th of July, 1776, a fellow Philadelphian denounced London for, quote, not only urging savages to invade the country, but instigating Negroes to murder their masters, unquote. The embodiment of colonial secession, George Washington, may have spent more time overseeing his enslaved Africans than he did supervising soldiers or government officials, suggesting the importance of this troublesome property. By 1764, he owed one of his London creditors a still hefty £1,800 and certainly had an incentive to both preserve his slave property and escape from the crown, which seemed to be calling it into question. John Adams, who earned handsome fees as legal counsel for slaveholders in cases against the enslaved, had little reason to disagree. Ditto for John Hancock, whose large signature on the nascent republic's founding document was somehow appropriate, since he was one of Boston's largest slave owners. James Madison speculated in late 1774, quote, if America and Britain should come into any hostile rupture, I am afraid an insurrection among Negroes may and will be promoted. In one of our countries lately, a few of those unhappy wretches met together and chose a leader who was to conduct them when the English troops should arrive, which they foolishly thought would be very soon, and that by revolting to them, they should be rewarded with their freedom, unquote. Prominent slaveholder and anti-London rebel Henry Lawrence of South Carolina was told that just before the April 1775 confrontation at Lexington between the Republicans and the Crown, the latter planned to instigate the enslaved to revolt, to blunt the settlers' initiative. By 1776, he was reportedly convinced that if London had its way, none but slaves and his officers and their taskmasters shall reside in America. Why does this sound like the same narrative that Midwestern Marks and these mega communists have about the fears of native liberation? Weird that, isn't it? Anyway, just something I noticed. He may have heard of the British subject of African descent, David Marguerite, who was in South Carolina in 1775 preaching about abolition. As the tempting of fate by Margaret and Carolina suggested, there were strong hints from Britain that sensitive settlers may have found in every sense unsettling. As June 1772 approached, beating slaves was much less common in London than in the colonies. Increasingly, Londoners were beginning to see slavery and slaveholders as an American phenomenon that sophisticated metropolitans disdained as uncivilized, partly because that was the view propounded by the growing number of Africans, perhaps 15,000 in British streets in the 1770s. That the colonists were prating about liberty while enforcing a draconian enslavement tended to induce an enmity, defensive response among Londoners, who began to castigate the settlers as tyrants themselves. Wittingly or not, reform proposals by London only served to incite the settlers even more, particularly those who were bent on imposing a model of development based on the mass enslavement of Africans. In 1775, a leading British official proposed that London was willing to return to the status quo ante of 1763 with regard to taxes and the like, if the settlers would concur with the notion that slavery was a vice that was contrary to the law of God. And thus, every slave in North America should be entitled to his trial by jury in all criminal cases, as a foundation to extirpate slavery from the face of the earth, unquote. With a flourish, it was added, quote, let it only contention henceforward between Great Britain and America be, which shall exceed the other in zeal for establishing the fundamental rights of liberty to all mankind, unquote. Settlers may have thought that this official was either daft or engaged in a dangerous provocation, but in any case, this was not the kind of proposal designed to attract the sincere attention of rebels, many of whom had invested fortunes in slavery and the slave trade. London appeared to present a clear and present danger to the lives and fortunes of settlers. A decision to rebel, though festooned in the finery of freedom, wound up depriving a countless number of Africans of the liberty that the 1776 revolt has been thought to have provided. As the 21st century proceeds, one point is evident. The heroic creation myth of the founding of the U.S. is desperately in need of revisiting. In November 1965, in remarks that escaped attention for the most part, Ian Smith, the leader of a newly founded racist republic that was Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe in 1980, argued that his unilateral declaration of independence was a replay of 1776. He and his comrades were seeking to escape the logic of decolonization, just as 1776 sought to escape the logic of slavery's abolition. Smith had a coarse disregard for the aspiration of Africans, as did his counterparts in 1776. Contemporary observers should note that Smith had as much success in integrating Africans successfully into his ill-fated republic as did his North American counterparts in the aftermath of 1776. Smith was defeated and justifiably has passed into the ignominy of history. The rebels of 1776 were victorious and have been hailed widely ever since, suggesting that there is something to be said for winning and shaping of history's judgment of a rebel. A few years before Smith's telling remarks, Blas Roca, a leader of what became the Communist Party of Cuba, then in a desperate confrontation with Washington, asked a question not often posed with Washington. Why, he asked, was the plight of Negroes in the U.S. probably worse than that of any other group of Africans in the hemisphere? Roca's plaint reflected the point that, unlike in Cuba, where the anti-colonial, anti-slavery struggles merged, in the person of Antonio Mercado, or in Mexico, where an early leader was of African descent, Vincent Guerrero, in what became the U.S., there was a divergence between the struggle against London and the struggle for abolition. In fact, arguably, these goals were at loggerheads, with Africans on the mainland standing largely at the side of London, and even more so after independence. It was inevitable that the path ahead for U.S. Negroes would be exceedingly rocky. Indeed, one of the more striking aspects of the anti-London struggle on the mainland was how often it merged with a black scare in the form of imprecations tossed at Lord Dunmore and the Governor Martin of North Carolina. Well after 1776, it remains striking that white supremacists were quite clear and precise as to the identity of their Brete Noir. For example, it has become veritable folklore that in order to escape successfully the pincers of Jim Crow, Africans with deep roots in the US often began speaking in French or Spanish so as to escape the damning accusation that they were descendants of mainland slaves, a group not notorious in its celebration of 1776, and quite willing to align with the Republic's foes in London thereafter. Though historians have pointed in various directions in seeking to explicate what has befallen Africans on the mainland, it is difficult to ignore the point that one central reason for this awful persecution has been the simple fact that this besieged group had their own ideas about the configuration of North America, and that their conceptions often involved collaboration with the antagonists of Euro-American elites, be they indigenes, Madrid, or ultimately London. The Negro dalliance with London, and then followed by various relationships with Mexico City, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Moscow, in a repetitive pattern of seeking leverage abroad to overcome rapacity at home. However, it was not until the late 1950s that Washington came to realize that perhaps easing racist oppression at home might serve to foil such dangerous diplomatic alliances. Until then, such relations served partially to provide further grist for the oppressive mill. Nevertheless, today the continuing invidious discrimination that undermines the descendants of enslaved Africans on the mainland stems in no small part from their historically consistent and staunch opposition to the capacious plans of slaveholding rebel, then Republican elites, which too often targeted these very same Africans. This chapter began with a remarkable instance of opposition to sacred principle of mainland settlers, slavery, which in June 1772 helped to ignite a new departure in our complex history. Part of the background suggesting how these Africans came to be in a London courtroom and how their audacity helped to ignite a Republican revolt will unwind in the following pages. So join me on Tuesday when we start Chapter 1, Rebellious Africans, How Caribbean Slavery Came to the Mainland. I hope you enjoyed that preface and that introduction, comrades. Thank you for listening.